Up next, the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show with Snowden Bishop. After this message.
Most people don't realize that cannabis is serious business that requires serious technology solutions. Hi, I'm Terry from Sunstate Technology Group, where we are seriously proud to provide technology and security systems that help cannabis companies compete and succeed. From planning and expansion to hardware and daily IT support, I'm here to tell you that having the right technology is critical to security and smooth business operations. Partner with a technology team that understands the unique needs of this industry. For details, visit sunstatetech.com/cannabis. sunstatetech.com/cannabis.
And now, it's time for the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show with Snowden Bishop. Listen in as Snowden interviews cannabis industry pioneers, marijuana experts, policymakers, medical practitioners, patients, and other amazing individuals with compelling stories to share. It all happens right now. Here's the Cannabis Reporter, Snowden Bishop.
Hi, and welcome back to the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show. I'm Snowden Bishop, and I'm happy you could join us. Not so long ago, very few elected officials would risk political capital supporting cannabis policy reform, even when confronted with the truth that prohibition was predicated on a deception that led to the mass incarceration of cannabis users. So deep was the stigma cemented in the American psyche that most lawmakers refused to even entertain a debate on the taboo issue. But thanks to the persistent activism over the last several decades, public demand for legalization has grown to the point that lawmakers who don't support it risk losing re-election. And rightly so. States now regulating cannabis have experienced economic growth, less crime, and fewer opiate fatalities. They're also enabling patients to explore cannabis therapy without the threat of prosecution. With indisputable evidence that cannabis is harmless and, in fact, saving lives, it has no business being in Schedule I alongside dangerous controlled substances like heroin, meth, and LSD. So, why hasn't it been repealed? The arcane federal policy has caused more harm than good, especially among the minority communities most frequently targeted by law enforcement. It's destroyed the families of millions of incarcerated marijuana offenders and perpetuated the insidious cycle of incarceration and economic hardship when convicts are stripped of voting rights and barred from securing housing and gainful employment. Even though cannabis is legal in more than half of the United States, law enforcement agencies are still prosecuting marijuana charges, and thousands of offenders are still incarcerated. And for what? Prohibition has failed to deter marijuana use, and yet billions of tax dollars have been spent enforcing marijuana policy and enriching private prisons who incarcerate the marijuana convicts. With the exception of the prison lobby and a handful of special interests, and, of course, the elected officials who rely on their campaign contributions, no one benefits from locking up marijuana users. Whether for political expediency or financial gain, the ongoing enforcement of a destructive, ill-conceived policy amounts to nothing more than an egregious miscarriage of justice. Lawmakers are not blind to the truth, and more importantly, they know we know the truth. And with that knowledge comes a moral obligation to do the right thing. If our elected officials won't fight for justice, they'll hear from activists like Steve DeAngelo, who has said he'll never stop fighting until the last marijuana prisoner is released. That's the topic of today's show, and I'm excited to say that he's here with attorney Sarah Gersten to talk about their fight for justice under their new organization, the Last Prisoner Project. First, let me tell you about Sarah Gersten. She's a Harvard-educated transactional attorney and founding partner at Gersten Saltman, where she specializes in intellectual property. She has also specialized in legislative policy, regulations, and international trade at a congressional agency and served as an associate at K&L Gates, where she assisted public and private companies in initial and secondary public offerings. As executive director and general counsel of the Last Prisoner Project, she's working with Steve DeAngelo to help repair the harms caused by the criminalization of cannabis through restorative justice efforts. And that leads me to Steve DeAngelo. As I mentioned, he's the founder of the Last Prisoner Project and happens to be one of the most prolific trailblazers in the cannabis industry. With 4 decades of activism and advocacy for the legalization of cannabis, Steve has become known as the father of the cannabis reform movement. Having focused his career on the intersection of advocacy and entrepreneurship, he's created numerous profitable ventures that simultaneously advance social goals. As co-founder of Harborside in Oakland, California, he established one of the very first 6 cannabis dispensaries ever licensed in the United States, which modeled the gold standard for scalable cannabis retail and cultivation operations. He has also pioneered a number of other iconic businesses like Steeple Hill Laboratories, the first lab dedicated to cannabis testing, and the ArcView Group, the first all-cannabis investment firm, as well as a number of other successful first-of-a-kind ventures. As founder of the Last Prisoner Project, he's focused on securing the release of thousands of prisoners that are still incarcerated for marijuana-related offenses, and helping ex-convicts expunge their records so that they can resume productive lives. Steve and Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thanks for having us, Snowden. Great to be here with you.
I'd like to start with you, Steve, because you've been called the father of the cannabis movement, a true pioneer in this industry in terms of moving it forward with public awareness. Just so that our audience is really aware of where you're coming from, can you tell me how you first became interested in advocating for cannabis?
Sure. My cannabis advocacy came directly out of my earliest experience with cannabis, which was when I was 13 years old. And long story short, I had a very, very profound experience with cannabis. Looking backwards, I consider it my first real, genuine spiritual experience. And I came out of that experience knowing that cannabis was going to continue to play a role in my life. And as soon as I realized that, I also realized that I was not willing to be a criminal the rest of my life. And so legalizing cannabis, telling the truth about cannabis became a prerequisite for my own personal happiness, and I made it my mission.
You know what? So many people gravitate toward cannabis for that very reason, and it's always seemed absurd to me that it was illegal, but when I started learning about it, I had absolutely zero idea that prohibition was based on lies. And the Controlled Substances Act, of course, it had a lot of racial implications, and it was a way of controlling certain population groups. When the Controlled Substances Act passed, what was it like back then? Because I know you were around during that era, and you were probably quite stunned when it happened.
Yeah, well, the story of what happened with the Controlled Substances Act is really interesting. At the time that the act was pending before Congress, and this is 1970, Nixon is president of the United States, and we were seeing just the beginnings of a cannabis reform movement, and so when the measure was being debated, the Controlled Substances Act was being debated in Congress, we had enough of an activist presence there that we were able to push back when the prohibitionists wanted to put cannabis into Schedule 1. And what happened, and few people know this story, is that as a result of the efforts that were made by the pro-cannabis advocates at that time, cannabis was only temporarily, quote unquote, placed into Schedule 1. And a blue ribbon presidential commission was impaneled, the Schaefer Commission. It was headed up by Governor Raymond Schaefer of Pennsylvania, who was a center-right former prosecutor. And the whole panel was composed of guys, mostly guys like Schaefer. But to Nixon's surprise, they actually did an objective and scientific analysis of cannabis. And just like everybody else who has taken an objective and scientific look at cannabis, came back understanding that all of the myths that they had been hearing were wrong. And the recommendation of the Schaefer Commission was that cannabis did not belong in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 or 4 or 5. They recommended that cannabis be removed entirely from the Controlled Substances Act and that its nonprofit transfer between adults be decriminalized. But Nixon wanted to continue using cannabis prohibition as a club against the people of color, against hippies, against the anti-war movement. And so he just trashed the report. He suppressed it. Congress never got it. And as a result, they've never had an opportunity to go back and revisit the Schedule 1 classification.
That's criminal in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I just tweeted out this morning this idea that, you think about people who have been arrested for cannabis during the years of prohibition, and the system would have us believe that these folks are criminals, that they did something wrong, that they did something harmful to society. And even though we're changing the laws now, that they should stay in. And I take completely the opposite view, right? The people who carried this plant through the long, dark years of prohibition, who brought it to people who needed it, who took the risks, big risks, and often paid heavy prices for it, were not criminals. They were heroes. And that's one reason that I'm so passionately committed to the idea of getting them released.
And that leads me to the Last Prisoner Project, because there are astonishing figures about how many people are still incarcerated, how many people over time have been incarcerated. And you figure for every person that has been incarcerated for a harmless plant, you've got an entire family that has suffered either financially or socially, or they've just been thwarted. And when these people are released, they can't vote. They can't, well, in some states anyway, they can't vote and they can't get jobs. I mean, this has really had a dramatic impact. So, Sarah, tell me just a little bit about the Last Prisoner Project.
Yeah, so I think you've really hit on the impetus for the project. And as Steve mentioned, I think it comes both from recognizing this problem, this disparity between the way a majority of Americans feel about marijuana and its legalization, and the way a majority of states have now either legalized in some form or decriminalized the plant, and the fact that we still have tens of thousands of Americans incarcerated for cannabis-related crimes. And on the other hand, you have those in the industry who are disproportionately white men building intergenerational wealth. And that's something we discuss a lot, is this idea of those who are able to build millions and billions of dollars in this industry and what they are able to do for their families, for their future, juxtaposed with exactly what you just discussed, which is the intergenerational harm that is occurring to those people, largely people of color, who are incarcerated or even who just have an arrest, a cannabis-related arrest on their record. The effects that has on not only the individual, but their family, their friends, their community. And so Steve, being in the position that he's in and having been able to create wealth in this industry, really recognized that disparity. And so he teamed up with his brother Andrew and our other co-founder, Dean Reyes, to do something about this and to really show the industry and those leaders and those executives in the now legal cannabis industry, the hypocrisy of building that wealth, but yet not doing anything for those victims of the war on drugs, those victims of the criminalization of cannabis, who are still incarcerated or who are still feeling the effects of being criminalized for their use of cannabis. So that was really the impetus for the project.
And let me understand too, are you also addressing the diversity in the industry, number one, but number two, does your advocacy go into sort of the political arena regarding private prisons, because they have profited grossly on the incarceration of drug convicts?